Okay, good afternoon, James. Thank you for coming here to join me on, my first time in this new studio, which is a little bit too classy for me, but
Very
clearly not for
swish.
you.
No, that's very swish. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So, James, just diving right into it, for those in the audience who don't know who James Harris is, perhaps you could just give us a bit of an overview of what you do now, your career journey, and a bit about yourself.
Okay. Thanks, Adam. So what I do now is I'm a partner in a law firm, international law firm here in Singapore. Been here 25 years. I'll come back to before then. What I do is essentially work in relation to energy transition, and infrastructure projects pretty much around the ASEAN region, but almost every year I'm involved in deals outside of ASEAN. So I'm currently doing things in Mongolia, Samoa, Vanuatu, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and maybe Saudi. So,
Okay, all right. So
that
it's getting more exotic.
Yeah. So how I got into it was actually I grew up on the Gold Coast. So
We won't hold that against you.
no, I know. Thank you. I really wanted to leave, and I wanted to travel and see the world. So I left 35 years ago to catch up with a friend that I used to play tennis with a lot, and we went and watched the French Open back in 1990, and that was the sort of start of 6 years in the UK. At the time, I was keen to do anything in finance. I'd been a lawyer in Australia through my training and stuff, doing mainly property type work, as you can imagine, on the Gold Coast and Brisbane.
I guess it would have been kind of boom times on the Gold Coast back then, right?
Oh, it was the whole Skays and Bond period.
Right. Yeah, we don't need to go
Sanctuary
into that.
Cove, White Shoe Brigade. You see why I wanted to leave.
Yeah.
So yeah, I got over to London. I actually had a job lined up in Hong Kong with a client on the way, but I didn't end up going back there. I stayed in London because I had a lot of friends there at the time. And they were all doing aircraft finance, which sounded really sexy because you got to travel a lot, and who's not into that? So,
Yeah.
so I did that for about 4 years. And then the execution of those deals is incredibly intense. It's like 3 weeks of very, very intense work, not a lot of sleep, a couple of days off, and then you do it all again. So after 4 years of that, I thought I need to balance this out with something else. So I moved more into the projects work. And that's when I started to do the infrastructure and some of the energy stuff. So that was in the early 90s, originally under the Margaret Thatcher period. So that was a fun time to be over there.
I bet. I mean, the choice not to go to Hong Kong, though, I imagine that might have been a hard one, right? Hong Kong at that time was also equally quite a bustling, busy, great place to be.
Yeah. I had a job lined up actually with an investment bank client that had asked me to come up there. And the only reason I didn't go back was that I just knew more people in London at the time. A lot of my, uni friends were over there.
I guess it was an Aussie story at that time as well, to go to London, and a pound would get you $3 at that point.
Exactly.
Different time.
Yeah. But I took a year off before I fell back into law firms. And that's where I tried to do something different. So I took a job sweeping out the warehouse of the California Cake and Cookie Company.
Okay, that's different.
In the East End for £1 an hour. I ended up working in one of Robert Maxwell's magazine companies as an assistant to the finance director, because I did commerce law, so I thought I'll take my commerce degree for a walk. And after about 10 months there, I realized I really enjoyed being a lawyer. So, and at the time you could do this sort of test down at the Westminster Council Hall, where you logged on and they would ask you questions about what your career would be suited to be. And I did it, and it came out lawyer or, solicitor, barrister, whatever. And I thought, I really want to try something else. I had to do it 4 times before I could find something.
Every time the answer was the same?
Yeah.
Wow.
On the 4th time, it was film producer.
Okay.
which actually isn't very different from what we do in a way. What we do is we just put a lot of things, bring a lot of things together. When I talk to junior lawyers about what we do, I sort of draw an analogy of trying to cook for a dinner party where you've got a lot of things on the go and it's all got to come together at one time and be served
For
out.
multiple people, different parties, different backgrounds.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That's what we do.
Yeah, so it was kind of predetermined for you. There's no getting away from it or around it.
Well, yeah, as I say, I did try. I took some time off and did the backpacking through Europe and tried a few other things. But ultimately, what it sort of drew me back was I enjoyed the people aspects. I enjoyed the sort of mental challenge of trying to find solutions to things. And I just enjoyed doing something that was going to have some purpose. At that stage, my brother, who didn't go to uni, had his own brick paving business in Sydney. And he would look back at the end of, a couple of days of work and he'd have, X 100 meters of paving or landscaping, and he could look at what he'd actually done.
What he built.
Yeah. And I'm like, what have I got to show for myself? A pile of papers.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried to rethink it and think about, more of the impact. So that's why I did less of the aircraft eventually. I don't do that anymore and focus more on the infrastructure and the energy.
Can't imagine that a lot of lawyers, I mean, I can't speak for the community at large, but just generally, I think it's synonymous with the industry. I don't think typically people think about lawyers wanting to have purpose or make an impact. I mean, I know there's a stereotype to it, but it's usually money-driven, career-driven, status. This sounds quite different and unique in that sense.
Yeah, that's never been a driver for me personally. Not complaining, but it's always been, very much achievement driven. What's the point of doing stuff unless it has some impact? And what I do now, especially around the region of Southeast Asia, has a lot of impact. The deals that we do bring water, sanitation, waste, power to areas that are not served by that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's always been a bit of a mantra of mine. I call it the MAD, make a difference. That's what I want to do.
Mm. Yeah, I don't think it's something we hear often in this community.
Yeah, I'm not your traditional lawyer. I'm from the Gold Coast, remember?
Yeah, that says it all.
Yeah.
So from the 90s doing aviation law, essentially in London, where does the journey then continue to bring you towards Asia? What does that look like?
So 6 years in London, my then girlfriend, now wife, said, I was born in the tropics. Her father was a pilot in New Guinea in the 60s. And she said, it's too cold here. So, of course, we went to Australia, back to Oz. She's originally, born in New Guinea, but grew up in Brisbane. So, of course, we went to Melbourne.
Mm-hmm.
Where at least 2 of the 4 seasons in one day are good. And we enjoyed that. But it was a little bit quiet after the buzz of an international hub like London.
I can imagine.
And I did take a little detour. I was seduced into the multidisciplinary practice thing, started what was then Ernst & Young Law in Melbourne with another guy. It's a great idea, but it didn't always work in practice. And for the kind of big ticket transactions, the really interesting ones, clients actually want lawyers that are different from their accountants or financial advisors. They want that tension to keep maybe track of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I came to Singapore to play golf with a mate, and he invited me to dinner, had a few friends over. One of them was a headhunter. And next thing you know, I've got interviews and I've got a couple of offers to come up here, and I moved up in 2000.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it seems a lot of your career choices have actually started or been triggered from sports, from tennis, from golf?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that,
Okay.
which is kind of ironic because I wouldn't really regard myself as a sportsman.
What was your thinking at that time in 2000? You've had some experience abroad. You've gone back to Oz. What did you want to do?
So we had a 2-month-old baby, and we thought, have we got one more adventure in us before we settle down, you know? And so we rolled the dice and decided to come up here. And 25 years later, I'm still here.
Yeah, you're stuck.
Well, not stuck, but I'm really, really lucky, Adam. I've had a really blessed kind of career. I've met a lot of really good people along the way. I've had some luck with opportunities, and you know, I'm very happy with how things have panned out.
It's great to hear. It's a good mindset.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has their days, but I always, when I was much younger, used to very much listen to people who were much older about what lessons they had in life. There was really interesting, diverse group of people. There was one guy who was a kind of well-known landscape painter in Australia, and he had a lot of really interesting lessons on life that I used to listen to and think, I don't want to be that age and look back and say, I wish I'd done something, or I wish I'd tried something. I didn't want to have a look back of regrets.
Do you recall something that this individual said that really resonated with you?
I think the sort of underlying theme was always, what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, good advice.
You know, I'm sure there were a couple of things that multidisciplinary thing turned out to be not for me. And at the time, I really, really regretted it. But I realized later I learned a lot of really useful life lessons and, people skills, if you like. So, I think everything that happens to you in your life isn't just happenstance. It's sort of is brought about by, I don't know, some people can call it the law of attraction. Some people can call it fate. I think you do make your own destiny, maybe a bit subconsciously, about what you're steering towards, what you're interested in. And I see it in younger people as well.
I would agree. I'm a big believer in that. But what do you think particularly worked well for you, perhaps in your approach? You've obviously given us some insight to your mindset, and it's great to see. But was there a particular style that you've employed or a way of working that you think's given you a reason for being so successful?
Thanks for saying that. I put it down to a couple of things because this question does come up sometimes. I think that I don't necessarily see the negative as much as maybe others might. So therefore, I keep fairly optimistic. So when other people might have given up on things, it hasn't even entered my mind. And, that might be that I'm just from Queensland. Or it might be a good thing. I don't know. I think I don't get impacted by things as early or as quickly, maybe as others might, who might say, oh, this is not great, I'm out of here. I tend to plug on.
Where do you think that comes from?
Probably my mother. She's a bit like that. She's very tenacious like that.
She's still around?
Yeah.
What was she like growing up?
Australian housewife. We were pretty simple My dad was he worked on in the Merchant Navy on ships. Spent a lot of time traveling abroad. So mum just was at home on her own with me and then eventually a younger brother.
And she just got on with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, mum didn't. Neither of my parents even finished school, so they didn't have a lot of education. They didn't have the insights to sort of say, this is what you should do and you should study and get to uni. I just wanted to get out of the Gold Coast. So
Don't blame you.
I mean, I love it now.
Yeah.
But at the time, I'm like, living the Bay life thing was okay.
You knew there was more. There was more to.
For whatever reason, I wanted to go and practice my French.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I did.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Looking back again at the last 25 years here in Singapore, I'm sure you've seen a ton of change.
Yeah.
Not just in the Singapore context, but more in regards to your industry, energy, infrastructure. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen that have also perhaps had more impact with your work?
Good question. Over 25 years, well, at a sort of a grassroots level, over that 25 years, we've seen deal size going from the huge multi-billions into much smaller if you look at energy transition. So early 2000s and in the 90s, it was all about coal-fired power plants in Indonesia or Vietnam or Philippines or wherever. And eventually that sort of ran its course and that's no more. And so we're now looking at, 50, 150 megawatt solar, maybe 500 if there's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
So the actual deal size has come down, but the lawyer's work sort of stays the same.
The complexity has increased or stayed the same?
It's just different. You got to still find solutions. There's a lot more emphasis now on the environmental aspects, social safeguards, things like that come into play, which weren't so much 25, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been a big change in that particular aspect of the deals we work on. I guess another interesting change is, the role of the lawyer has kind of changed. I would like to think that people, the clients that we work with recognize that it's not just sort of a black and white letter law response. Yes, no, can, cannot, whatever, about can I do this, whatever. It's now, okay, well, look, there are some implications you need to think about. We've seen these things arise on other transactions and we've looked at a couple of different ways of getting around something. This is the one that seems to be the easiest, least costly, doesn't take as long. So there's more, I would like to think, more of an advisory element than a simple
like
yes, no, can, cannot. Here's a long, written report that, people don't have time to read that stuff. They just want the deal taken forward. And the way I've also tried to conduct things is I put myself in the position of the recipient of the advice or whatever I'm giving. And am I going to make their day easier? Am I going to let them get home and see their spouse and kids? Or am I just going to give them something that makes them ask a whole lot of new questions? And that latter one is really the one I get the most worked up about with our junior lawyers, because I'll always critique what they come up with and I'll say, great, that's legally, technically correct, but it doesn't tell me anything.
And what does it mean for the client? How does it help them? But I guess that's a question you would want to ask.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that's why I guess I've been able to, still remain in the industry and doing what I do, is I think people realize that, my kind of can-do mentality is useful.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds a bit self-promoting, but I find sometimes you do come across other lawyers who it's just like a brick wall.
Yeah.
There's no, how do we resolve this? And I think that was something I learned early on. I had some really good mentors. I had 3 that I always look back on.
Mm-hmm.
The first one in Australia when I was learning was such an attention to detail guy.
Who was he?
You want his name?
Well, not a name, but what was the context? What was the relationship?
Oh, he was my boss.
Okay.
And I was a junior lawyer. And literally I'd walk into his office with a piece of paper, which was, back then that's how it was done.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd pick up his red pen before he'd even looked at me. And he'd just rewrite everything, which at the time drove me nuts. And most of it, I would say, didn't really change anything substantively, but it was just a more technically correct way of putting things, and would pick up on lots of really, really important detail.
What value or quality do you think you imparted from him, from that type of process?
Definitely the attention to detail. Trying to think 5 steps ahead. I at the time, my work colleagues would always make fun of my situation, saying, this particular guy's making your life hell, blah, blah, blah. And I'd be saying, yeah, but, years later, I realized it was really good training. It made me really understand the need to pay attention to all the detail. The second one was in London, where I worked with technically excellent partners, just super smart, but super easy to sort of follow. And I really honed the craft of, I suppose, being a lawyer. And I learned how to cut through all the nonsense and just give very practical responses.
What's an example of some of the nonsense in your job?
The nonsense. The nonsense is anything that is raised that doesn't advance or take the transaction forward. If it's, it could be a bit banal, like how many days notice you get. You shouldn't be arguing over that. You shouldn't be negotiating whether it's 20 or 30 days. If the occasion arises where the proverbial hits the fan, yes, it's good to know how many days you've got. But even if you run short, usually the parties are trying to find a solution. So they'll just agree an extension.
Yeah, it's more semantics.
Yeah, there's very little value in lawyers across either side of a table sort of wasting time, in my view, over things like that don't advance the deal.
Do you think that's just probably a symptom of tradecraft, that they're practicing what they're trained and paid to do most of their careers and lives?
I think it is, and maybe this is going to sound controversial, but I think it's just a result of their own exposure to different types of transaction. So the more you are involved in lots of, say, bigger size transactions, the more you place your attention on the really important things. And if you're doing more routine type stuff, you then maybe just go into autopilot and say, let's spend 10 minutes about how many days notice clause should be.
Right. You tend just to focus on the process and less on the outcomes at that point.
I don't know. I think certainly when I went back to Australia after 6 years in London, I realised that in London there's such an intensity of activity, of deal flow, it's like, I used to describe it as, it's a bit like watching the planes land at Heathrow.
Mm.
There's if you look up in the sky, you'll see 3 or 4 sets of lights. There's one coming in, there's another one after it, another one after that. So when you're working in that environment, you kind of get used to just getting on with it and moving forward.
Can't get bogged down with these details that don't really matter at the end of the day.
Well, they have obviously importance, and I'm not trying to denigrate that. But at the end of the day, in the scheme of things, they're like a category 5. And no one's going to thank me if I've negotiated an extra 10 days in the notice clause when the deal craters because we've missed the important stuff.
Yeah, it's good to note. I kind of cut you off there, but you're going towards, I think, the third mentor.
Yeah, the third mentor was actually back in Australia. A bit of a rough and ready partner that I worked for, who he used to basically say, you've got to get the client over the line. So he taught me a lot about getting the deal done. Not at any price, not saying that or whatever. I'm just saying making sure that you get the client over the finish line. So the combination of, attention to detail, technical excellence, focusing on getting the client over the finishing line, that's the kind of stuff I try and impart now with our team members.
Are these qualities that you recognize and see not just amongst your own team members, whether they're your junior or someone working alongside you, but do you see this amongst the whole legal community or less so?
I'd say less so.
Less so. Why do you think that is?
Because other people have other motivations. Some people, I don't know if it's correct to say that it's just a job for them or it's a bit autopilot, but I don't want to go into that mode. I don't want to just going through the motions.
Do you think what I referenced earlier, where, again, a stereotype here, but generally where a lot of people choose law and go into that profession for status, to become partner at some point, to have the fancy car, to have the big package, to have the reputational privileges, do you think that sometimes then supersedes the purpose? In your case, you have a purpose, right?
Yeah, not quite.
Okay.
But I had to explain to them, this is the legal framework, this is what you get, but this is how it works in practice, and these are the relevant agencies you need to get to know, and this is the rollout of the first auction round, etc. So I think, in hindsight, that was, I guess, early mover advantage. And then as deal size started to shrink, my proposals, which, as I mentioned before, the amount of work you do on an energy transition transaction is kind of the same, whether it's a $50 million deal or a $500 million deal. It's kind of the same suite of contracts. It'll be the same negotiations, the same financing, the same, legal and regulatory approvals, stuff like that. So when you're on a $50 million deal or even a $20 million deal, the budget isn't there for the legal spend that would be there for a $500 million or a $1 billion deal.
Yeah.
So I kept losing proposals because the costs were too high.
You weren't aligned to what was really available in terms of the opportunity.
Well, I was pricing what I thought was competitively, but it still wasn't low enough to justify doing the deal. So in a lot of instances, I would be pricing with 2 or 3 other firms, say, and mostly we'd probably come out about the same. So in that situation, the deal just didn't happen because the costs of doing it were too high. So I had this idea of how can we simplify and streamline this? So I've started that about 4 or 5 years ago with a particular client where we said, all right, let's streamline your documentation, because probably your own customer or client, English is their second language anyway. So let's simplify it really so that they understand what they're getting into, and let's make this as automated as possible so that the relevant officer in the field literally can pull out their mobile phone, talk to the customer and go through a series of questions, punch it all in.
It's easy for them.
And then push a button, boom. Firstly, here's your NDA. Secondly, here's your term sheet. Here's your mandate letter. And it's made the whole thing much faster and cheaper. And I've had people say to me, aren't you doing yourself out of work? And the response I have there is two things. Well, if I don't do it, someone else will. But it's actually work that no one would get, as I mentioned, because the pricing was just too high. So the thing I'm looking forward to do in the next sort of rollout of my career, 5 or 10 years, whatever, is bring more of that into it. So it's not just document automation, because that's good. But once you've captured the data in all of this, it's really useful, and it can help the ultimate client with a number of different things. And it can help them because you use the data, you can analyze the data, and the technology exists to turn the data into information, spreadsheets, pie charts, bar graphs, and things like that. And they can show trends. So I'll give you a simple example. We're way off topic, by the way.
No, this is, I think, very relevant because it talks about where your industry is heading.
So here's an example. Colleagues were doing the same thing in the UK for a big supermarket chain, and the technology identified that a particular region in the UK had a disproportionately high number of unfair dismissal claims. That wasn't something anyone was looking for, but the technology discovered that, brought it out. And so therefore the supermarket chain was like, oh, okay, we've got a training problem here. We need to go and help sort this out. So I want to apply that kind of approach and thinking to what I do to help deliver, water projects, power projects, hospitals, schools, roads, rail.
So how would that look, practically speaking, in your world, and the difference that it's going to make if you were to apply that process and that methodology?
Well, we're already doing it, so that, I suppose, is good. How does it look? My approach to this was not to go for big bang immediately, because it's hard and you need to take people on that journey at all levels. I always say you can only go as fast as the weakest link in the chain. So I have incrementally taken that through to be able to have, as I say, deals that are maybe not a huge size in dollars, that those deals get done. So what do you mean that looks like? I don't know. We now have, small villages in places that have water or sanitation, or, there's hopefully improvements in, education, or, we're building it up, and we're going to hopefully be able to do more. The deal size will get bigger, and those benefits will carry through. And the feedback we've got is that it is making a difference in terms of time to deliver things, time to get the deals done, ease and simplification. Again, my ambition here was, I imagine somebody who's the ultimate client, in this case, probably a borrower. I want them to be able to pull out a couple of schedules from the loan agreement, pin them on their wall in their cubicle, and that's their to-do list for the month or the quarter or the year. Real simple.
Mm-hmm.
Just pull it out. Okay, this is what I've got to do. These are my information delivery requirements. These are my other requirements. I don't think it's rocket science. I think it's just common sense.
And you're making it really bite-sized as well for people to understand and what they need to do and what it means for them.
That's a good point, because in preparing for this, I did try and think about things like my approach to stuff. And one of the things that my mother says and my wife says is that I'm very good at explaining complicated things in simple ways, which I never really think about. Probably because I'm not good at people explaining complicated things in complicated ways. Rather have it laid out really simply.
Well, I think it goes back to what you referenced to earlier, where you're sitting in the client's perspective.
Yeah.
I think that's empathy, the ability to sit in someone's shoes and say, how will this matter to them? How does it help them?
Yeah, I guess.
Do you think your approach of this this legal approach, do you think it also allows maybe for smaller projects, which arguably there's impact needed, but because traditionally perhaps in the past, if it's not $50, $100 million value, big law firms like Pinson Masons and others would say, well, we can't really do anything here. This is no budget. It's not worth, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. But this has allowed you to make impact and offer advice and support to a lot of these projects, which do need your value and expertise.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And the irony is it will also end up helping competitor firms, because we've created precedents and templates and processes and procedures and methodologies to simplify a lot of this stuff, and the clients get used to it, and then they just want it from everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but all boats rise with higher tide.
Yeah, like I said, I was asked, will you be cutting work out that you would have otherwise get? I don't think so, because at the end of the day, for me, it's important that these things happen because of the impact. If I was 20 years younger, maybe I'd be driven by different things. But at the moment...
No, I don't think you would. I think you are who you are, right?
Probably. The one thing that I do always look back on, this might sound corny, is what's something that I do, or is what I do something that my kids are going to not necessarily be proud of, but at least not be embarrassed about, And if I'm doing something that they're not going to be embarrassed about, that to me is a good thing to be doing.
I think that's a good litmus test as well in terms of choices you make and what you decide to end up doing with your time.
Well, they keep you pretty real.
They do. They do. Going back on the energy transition subject.
Yep.
What do you think is working well, and then adversely what's not working well?
Good question. So we are definitely in a transition, and it's a little bit like the eye of the storm in a sense that you're not 100% sure where you are. And I say that because two things, I guess. Firstly, we've got at the moment volatility, let's call it, in the global market. So there's so much uncertainty about what's happening and various things. The other thing that's going on is this technology revolution, more AI and stuff like that. So you've got a lot of major things that are causing people to find it perhaps a bit difficult to know where we are in the storm, if you like, and where this transition is going to go. I think markets that are doing well in that are probably the ones that are just not getting too wrapped up in those parts and are just kind of focusing on, okay, let's just try and achieve our net zero goals. And how can we do that? Well,
Which is a big task.
it's a huge task. And, you know, it's probably beyond today's session. It's an interesting topic about trying to force, let's call it third world countries, to adhere to net zero objectives when they haven't necessarily caused the whole problem in the first place and need a lot of the basics. But back to your question, I think, you know, Australia's a good example of a market that seems to be just motoring along, but it's not a big market. Then you've got China that actually is making a lot of progress. And a lot of that is not getting international airplay. We're lucky we have a pretty big China team, so I get to see what's going on there. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of misinformation out there, but at the end of the day, they're doing pretty well in their own country. Obviously, they're doing well expanding outbound, but they're doing quite well in their own country in terms of net zero. Japan also. Korea's trying, sort of getting there. And then you've got other jurisdictions that are just getting into it. The Philippines. Indonesia, interestingly, has been a bit slower to get into it. India's trying, but it's got sort of a number of challenges. Then you can sort of start to look at various other places, Vietnam, Bangladesh. They're a bit harder.
What's not working and what needs to change for let's say a more accelerated transition?
Good question. I would say there just needs to be some economies of scale in the process so that you're not trying to reinvent the wheel every time you roll out a new transition program in a country. I think we'll see it a little, but for instance, offshore wind, Taiwan in the region sort of got in first and has done really well. Then Japan started to look at it and they have done pretty well as well. And then you had Korea, but Korea sort of faltered a bit. And then you start to look at these other markets and they don't necessarily have the right institutional setup or the right legal and regulatory framework set up for the fundamentals that are needed for investors and their lenders to be able to do transactions. And that can be, you know, uncertainty around things like tariff. It can be around, I don't know, grid connection issues or whatever. You know, there's a whole series of other issues that, you know, whether it was energy transition or not, kind of exist anyway in these countries. So that's still an evolution. So about 20% of what I do these days is working with multilaterals to help some of these countries better define their frameworks and bring some transactions to market to sort of break through those barriers. An example might be in Indonesia years ago. Everyone was trying to get sub-sovereign deals done. So not at the ministry level, but maybe a regional level, a provincial level, or a different level of agency below sort of ministry, below national, below sovereign. Everyone said, great idea. Indonesia's huge. We need water. We need whatever. But the water authorities, they're just not creditworthy. So how do we resolve that? But the interesting thing was at the time, everyone was saying, oh, we need to improve our legal documentation and our structure. And I said, yeah, you do. But don't forget to deal with the credit enhancement of your off-taker or your, you know, bulk water purchaser. And it wasn't until it was kind of like right up against people's faces that I went, oh, yeah, okay, we're going to have to fix that. And then we're going to have to deal with the concept of value for money. And so that's a good example. And I've been lecturing at SMU now for 12 years, I think. I use that as an example of, how to learn from those lessons when trying to open up new markets to energy transition deals, whether that's Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, any of the stans, even places like Bangladesh, Vietnam.
Is there a particular country or specific technology, an emerging sector that really excites you, and why?
There's a few. I have been mostly involved in solar and wind and a bit of hydro, but what's emerging is hydrogen and carbon capture, utilization, storage stuff. And I think that's an area that is potentially going to be also part of the solution. And it reminds me of another point that I probably should have made somewhere, that the funding for these types of transactions is evolving. We talked about the deal size, the last 25 years. I didn't get back to that. But one of the other big changes is on the funding side. It used to be 25 years ago, there were a lot of international banks and some multilaterals and some other players in the market who provided all this funding on a very kind of traditional limited recourse project finance basis. And you had the 97 crisis in Asia, you had the 2007-8 global crisis. A lot of that changed. A lot of those banks, some of them disappeared. Some of them stopped doing the same kind of long-term lending. And you started to see the development of new players. So that's another area that I think is going to become more significant in the next 5 to 10 years. So you'll start to see funds that are being set up that will start to be used to deploy financing.
I think we already are.
Yeah. But I think you're going to see more of them.
Yeah, I agree.
I think you're going to see more of them. Singapore's a good example of where they've already cottoned onto this, and the Monetary Authority here is behind a lot of the push, and the MOF, to develop Singapore as a hub for this kind of activity. And you've also got private debt coming.
You're describing blended finance, right?
It's a concept that's part of it, but there are players out there that are getting support from multilaterals, whatever, as well. And we're seeing new types of structure and new types of financing and new types of ways of doing things, and that's exciting. That's fun to be part of at the beginning.
I think it's necessary because this is a 21st century subject.
Yeah,
we can't apply a 20th century approach. These big banks, as you mentioned, project financing, game's changing. It's going to continue.
Well, they're not interested in it.
What would you say
so much?
If I said that a lot of my network, and I suspect some of yours, claims now that hydrogen is nothing but a pipe dream?
I would say the jury's still out. I wouldn't say it's a pipe dream. Because of what I mentioned before, there will be new drivers for evolution or revolution in the energy transition market. And you're going to see technology be able to bring better solutions in quicker, faster, cheaper. And I'm not going to say that that's a pipe dream, because who knows, in 5, 10 years.
You're right. Who knows? No one thought probably 15 years ago we'd be where we are with cost of panels and solar just having huge adoption rates
Correct.
across the world. Moving a bit away to, you personally, away from the professional side of things, if that's okay. James, I know you a bit as a friend, and I've had that privilege now for a couple of years. When you're not in the energy projects, infrastructure, legal space, who is James Harris?
Who's
What
James
do you do?
Harris? First and foremost, I'm a husband and a father. That's a really big part of what I am. I have some long-term interest in water sports, be it swimming, jet skiing, kayaking, surfing.
You own a jet ski here?
Don't have a jet ski here. I have one in Australia.
Of course.
And I used to have a boat here, but I don't now. I got a little boat in Oz. Love boats.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm not doing that, I'm looking at opportunities to make a difference in areas that relate to that. So, this weekend there's a coastal cleanup along the East Coast, so I'll join in that. And I always do the Australia Day thing when I'm down there.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that, I'm a big passionate person about trying to keep our waterways clean.
Mm.
And my spirit animal is the turtle.
Okay.
There's an insight for you.
Yeah, why turtle?
I don't know. I'm just, attracted to turtles. I love swimming with turtles.
Where have you swum with turtles?
Yeah. Loads of places
Where
in
was
Australia.
Where was the best place you've done it?
I've done it in Bali. I've done it in Australia. Done it in Malaysia. That's probably the closest and best place. I haven't been to some fancier places like the Maldives yet, but
Oh yeah, you should.
one day.
Yeah, the water one's interesting. We did a kind of an ESG day with our team last year. We went to the Singapore River. There's a great organization that supports companies that they want to do this.
Yeah.
We cleaned up 55 kilos of plastic in about 3-4 hours.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
I didn't think there was just that much plastic possible in Singapore, which is a clean country, right? So it just, it makes you wonder and think.
Yeah. So, there's an organization out of the US called 4Ocean, and I've supported that in different ways. Usually friends and family will get a Christmas gift of something that's from recycled plastic.
Well, I think I've seen that. They make sunglasses and similar products from plastic they clean up in the ocean. Yeah.
Bracelets.
Okay. So if you give me a bracelet for a gift, I know that it was an ex-plastic bottle.
Yeah.
It's good to know. Aside from that, what fuels you, sustains you, keeps you grounded, and, just really gives you energy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if this is a good thing or not, but I like to have achieved something with my day. So that drives me to do things with my day. And there are times when that I just go, I'm going to give myself a day off.
Mm-hmm.
And, a couple of hours later, I'm like climbing the walls. I've got to go and do something,
Mm-hmm.
achieve something, make something happen. So I guess that's what keeps me going. And I think I've got that again from my mum.
Did you ever think about walking away from law?
I did. Like I said, when I was in London, I didn't do that for the first year. I did the California Cake Cookie Company and then the publishing company. And I did the career test down at the council place to think about what else I could do. And I realized I kind of enjoy it. So sad as that might sound.
No, it's great as long as you enjoy what you do.
And and that's the other thing. I'm very lucky in that what I do, I learn a lot of new stuff all the time. The first time I did a waste to energy deal, I learned so much about the waste to energy industry. And, I could bore you senseless with all sorts of interesting stuff. When I first did my first desalination deal, I learned about reverse osmosis. My first power deal, hospital, school. I did the Singapore Stadium here for the government for 12 years. You just learn, and I think that's what keeps me going. Is I'm always learning.
I think you're generally a very curious individual as well.
Probably.
Where's this going for you? And if you don't mind me saying, you're at a stage in your life where a lot of people would probably step back a bit, take a bit easy, you amass a bit of wealth and not trade your time for working for an organization. So what's the end game?
The end game would be a combination of a boat in Australia that is parked at the Gold Coast that I take up to Hamilton Island or Maroochydore or whatever every so often, with kids eventually, grandkids, not in any hurry, but still doing something that keeps me active and mentally challenged and all of that. I'm not going to be able to just retire and...
I don't think you could.
Well, you see so many people when they stop,
they lose their purpose.
They lose their purpose, and a lot of them die fairly quickly after that.
Yeah,
so
sadly so.
Yeah, so I don't want to, while I've still got breath and while I can still walk and remember stuff, I'll keep plugging away. I would like to perhaps do stuff in some new jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I've started looking at Central Asia and even the Middle East. Still enjoy what I do here, but there's new challenges, new cultures.
Yeah.
I love hummus.
That helps. New frontier. Just before we wrap up, what would be one key bit of advice you'd give to someone who's now entering the legal profession in 2025? Think about you when you started your career 30, 35 years ago. What would you say?
Okay. If they've already joined and I haven't been able to talk them out of it, I'd say focus for the first 4 years on just being a sponge. Take it in. Just let it all go in. Don't try and know everything. You will screw up. Learn from it. Try not to make the same mistake a second or a third time. Think about what your output is and whoever's receiving that output. Is it helpful or is it just waffle or is it not very practical? I would say to them, learn as much as you can and have fun. That's always been a big thing.
Yep.
I did say 20 odd years ago that I would not do this if it wasn't fun.
Mm-hmm.
And if I didn't have clients to work with that I really enjoyed, and a lot of clients do become friends and things like that. So I think you've got to have some boundaries around that too.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully this has been fun.
It's been
For
very
me,
fun.
it has.
We traversed a lot of areas that I didn't think we were going to.
That's how it goes. James, thank you so much for being here. All the best, and we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks,
Okay,
Adam.
cheers.